The scent of formaldehyde clings to my fingers as I strip off the latex gloves, the fluorescent lights humming their familiar dirge above the examination table. Another Jane Doe lies before me, her story written in bruises and needle marks, a narrative I've read too many times in this sterile basement of Seattle General. The clock reads 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, and the morgue feels colder than usual, though cold has never bothered me the way it should. I run my hands under the tap, watching pink-tinged water swirl down the drain. The soap's antiseptic burn reminds me why I chose this work. Surrounded by death, I can almost forget what I am, what I was. The dead don't judge. They don't flinch when they catch something predatory flickering behind my careful human mask. My reflection wavers in the metal surface of the sink, and for a moment, I see shadows of the creature I used to be. Centuries of blood and power, of commanding legions that moved like whispers through the night. But that was before the curse, before I traded my crown for this hollow existence among corpses and clinical reports. The elevator dings somewhere above, echoing down the empty corridors. Night shift means solitude, which suits me perfectly. I've spent the last 15 years building this identity, Dr. Ethan Miller, the quiet medical examiner who works the graveyard shift and keeps to himself. No one questions why I never eat lunch or why my office has blackout curtains. In a city like Seattle, eccentricity blends into the rain-soaked landscape. I'm reaching for my coat when the emergency alert crackles through the radio on my desk. All units, we have reports of abandoned minors in Pioneer Square. 2 juveniles, approximately age 6, found by a homeless individual near the Christmas tree. Something twists in my chest, an unfamiliar sensation that takes me a moment to recognize as concern. I shouldn't care. I've trained myself not to care about the living, to focus only on the stories the dead tell me. But my hand is already reaching for my keys. The drive through downtown Seattle feels different tonight. Christmas lights blur past my windshield like fallen stars, and the usual holiday crowds have thinned to scattered groups of late-night revelers and the forgotten souls who call the streets home. Pioneer Square sits in the heart of the old city, where brick buildings hold secrets in their shadows, and the smell of the sound mingles with exhaust and desperation. I park near the towering Christmas tree, its lights casting everything in alternating red and green. 2 patrol cars sit with engines running, their headlights cutting through the mist that rises from the warming grates. I shouldn't be here. This isn't my jurisdiction, isn't my responsibility. But something pulls me forward, a magnetism I haven't felt in decades. The officers stand in a loose circle around a cardboard shelter, their voices low and professional. I catch fragments of their conversation, no identification, hypothermia risk. Child services is backed up. I approach slowly, my medical examiner's badge catching the light. Dr. Miller, Seattle General, I say to the nearest officer, a young woman whose breath forms small clouds in the frigid air. I heard the call, thought I might be able to help assess their condition. She nods, stepping aside, and that's when I see them. 2 girls, identical in every way that matters, huddled together beneath a pile of mismatched blankets. They can't be more than 6 years old, with dark hair that catches the Christmas lights and eyes that seem far too old for their faces. But it's not their appearance that stops me cold. It's the scent that rises from their small forms, something ancient and familiar that makes my long dormant instincts surge to life. The hunger hits me like a physical blow. After 15 years of careful control, of feeding only on the already dead, my fangs threaten to extend. I grip the edge of a nearby bench, the metal groaning under pressure that would crush human bones. One of the girls looks up at me, and I see recognition flicker in her dark eyes. Not of me specifically, but of what I am. She tilts her head, studying me with the intensity of a predator recognizing another predator, and whispers something to her sister in a language I haven't heard spoken in centuries. Old Romanian, the language of my birth, of my first death, of the court where I once held dominion over creatures that haunted the spaces between midnight and dawn. "Sir?" The officer's voice seems to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" I force myself to breathe, though I don't need to, and straighten slowly. The girls continue to watch me, and I realize they're not afraid. They should be terrified of the cold, of abandonment, of the strange man whose eyes have gone black in the shifting light. Instead, they seem almost expectant. "I'm fine," I manage, though my voice sounds rougher than usual. "Just concerned about their exposure to the elements. How long have they been out here?" "Hard to say. The man who found them thinks maybe a couple hours, but they were already settled in when he noticed them. No adults in sight, and no signs of where they came from." I kneel slowly, bringing myself to their eye level. The scent grows stronger, not just ancient blood, but something else. Power, legacy, the kind of bloodline that vampire councils would go to war over. "Hello?" I say softly, switching to English, though every instinct screams at me to respond in the old tongue. "I'm Ethan. What are your names?" The girl who spoke first exchanges another glance with her sister, then looks back at me with those impossibly knowing eyes. "Mira," she says, her accent faint but unmistakable. "And this is Luna." She pauses, tilting her head again. "You smell like the old stories our mama used to tell us." My blood, what little flows through my veins, turns to ice. Around us, the officers continue their procedural discussions, oblivious to the supernatural tension crackling in the air. But these children, these impossible children, see me for exactly what I am. "Your mama," I repeat carefully. "Where is she now?" Mira's expression darkens, and Luna presses closer to her sister. "Gone," Mira whispers. "The shadow men came and Mama said we had to run. She said someone would come for us, someone who remembered the old ways." The hunger roars through me again, but this time it's accompanied by something I thought I'd lost forever. Protectiveness. These children carry the blood of my kind, abandoned and vulnerable in a world that would destroy them if it knew what they were. And somehow, impossibly, they've been led to me. I stand slowly, my mind racing through possibilities and dangers. Taking them would complicate everything, would risk the careful anonymity I've built. But leaving them to the system would be a death sentence of a different kind. "Officer," I say, turning to the young woman who's been coordinating the scene, "I'd like to volunteer as emergency foster placement. I'm a doctor, I have the space, and given the hour and the holiday, it might be the best option until permanent arrangements can be made." She looks surprised but not suspicious. In her world, medical professionals volunteering to help abandoned children is admirable, not alarming. As she radios for approval and begins the paperwork, I turn back to the girls. They're watching me with those ancient eyes, and Mira nods once, a gesture of acceptance that carries the weight of centuries. "Come on," I say, extending my hands to them. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Their small fingers are like ice against my skin, but as they curl around mine, something stirs in the deepest part of my being. something I thought the curse had killed forever. The drive to my house passes in relative silence. The girls press together in the back seat of my sedan. I catch glimpses of them in the rearview mirror, their eyes reflecting the streetlights like small animals. The radio plays soft Christmas carols, a soundtrack that feels absurdly normal given the supernatural weight of what I've just done. My house sits in the Queen Anne neighborhood, a modest craftsman that I chose for its privacy rather than its charm. Tall hedges and mature trees shield it from curious neighbors, and the basement has been specially modified for my particular needs. As I pull into the driveway, I realize I'll need to make adjustments. Children require light, warmth, the illusion of safety. Inside, I guide them to the living room, switching on lamps and adjusting the thermostat. The space feels foreign with their presence, too sterile, too empty of life. They stand close together, taking in their surroundings with the careful assessment of creatures who've learned not to trust sanctuary. "Are you hungry?" I ask, though I realize I have no idea what children eat. My refrigerator contains mostly medical supplies and the occasional bottle of wine I use for appearances. "We don't eat much," Luna speaks for the first time, her voice softer than her sister's, but carrying the same old-world cadence. "Mama said our kind needs different things. Their kind, our kind." The words hang in the air between us, acknowledgement of the truth we all know but haven't spoken aloud. I kneel again, bringing myself to their level. "What did your mama tell you about people like me?" Mira steps forward, her small hand reaching out to touch my cheek. Her fingers are warming now, and where they make contact, I feel something I haven't experienced in centuries. A connection that goes deeper than blood, deeper than hunger. "She said the old kings were sleeping," Mira whispers, "but that one day, when we needed them most, they would wake up." The words hit me like a physical blow. Old kings. The plural suggests she knows there were others like me, others who once ruled the shadows before the curse scattered us to the winds. "And she said," Luna adds, moving to stand beside her sister, "that we would know them by their sadness." I close my eyes, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on me. These children see through every careful facade I've built, every human pretense I've maintained. They see the broken king beneath the medical examiner's mask. When I open my eyes, they're both watching me with expressions of infinite patience, as if they've been waiting their entire short lives for this moment. "I'm not a king anymore," I tell them, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a man trying to make amends for things he can't undo." "That's what makes you a king," Mira says simply. The simplicity of her statement, the absolute certainty in her voice, cracks something open inside me. For the first time in 15 years, I allow myself to feel the full weight of what I've lost. Not just my power or my immortal court, but my purpose. These children, with their ancient blood and impossible wisdom, are offering me something I thought was gone forever. Redemption. I reach out slowly, gathering them both into an embrace that feels like coming home and stepping into damnation all at once. They melt against me, their small bodies radiating a warmth that seeps through my shirt and into the hollow space where my heart should beat. Their warmth was unbearable. I almost remembered what it felt like to be alive. Their warmth was unbearable. I almost remembered what it felt like to be alive. But memories are dangerous things for creatures like me. As I held Mira and Luna against my chest, feeling their heartbeats drum against my ribs, the careful walls I'd built around my past began to crumble. The scent of their blood, ancient, powerful, familiar, awakened something that had been dormant for decades. I pulled back gently, studying their faces in the lamplight. The resemblance was there, hidden beneath the innocence of childhood, but unmistakable to eyes that had seen centuries pass. The shape of their eyes, the way shadows seemed to cling to them even in the warm glow of my living room. They carried the markers of a bloodline I thought had been extinguished long ago. "We should get you settled," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "You need rest." But even as I led them upstairs to the guest room I'd never expected to use, questions gnawed at me. Who was their mother? How had she known to send them to Pioneer Square, to the one place in Seattle where their scent would draw me out of hiding? And what were these shadow men Mira had mentioned? I found spare blankets in the linen closet, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind raced. The guest room felt too exposed, too vulnerable with its large windows facing the street. I pulled the curtains closed and switched on the bedside lamp, casting everything in warm yellow light. "Will you stay?" Luna asked as I tucked the blankets around them. Her dark eyes held a fear she hadn't shown before, the kind of terror that comes from being abandoned too many times. "I'll be downstairs," I promised. "Just call if you need anything." But sleep didn't come for any of us. I sat in my kitchen, staring at my hands and trying to process what had happened. Every instinct screamed that I should contact child services, should remove myself from this situation before it spiraled beyond my control. These children were a complication I couldn't afford, a risk to the careful anonymity that had kept me alive. Yet when I closed my eyes, I saw Mira's face as she'd whispered about old kings. I felt Luna's small hand in mine, trusting and warm. For 15 years, I'd existed in a state of suspended animation, neither truly alive nor properly dead. These children had awakened something in me that felt dangerously close to hope. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted my brooding. Mira appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair mussed from sleep but her eyes alert. "Luna's having the dreams again," she said simply. I followed her upstairs, finding Luna curled in a tight ball beneath the blankets, her small body trembling. She was speaking in her sleep, words in that ancient Romanian that made my blood sing with recognition. "She dreams of the shadow court," Mira explained, climbing back into bed beside her sister. "Mama said it's because our blood remembers what came before." I knelt beside the bed, reaching out instinctively to smooth Luna's hair. The moment my fingers made contact with her skin, the trembling stopped. Her breathing evened out, and the foreign words faded into peaceful silence. "You have the touch," Mira observed, her voice carrying a gravity that belonged to someone far older. "Mama said only the true kings could calm the blood dreams." "I'm not," I started, but she cut me off with a look that was pure ancient authority despite her 6-year-old face. "You are what you are," she said. "Pretending doesn't change the truth." The next few days passed in a strange domestic rhythm that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. I called in sick to work, something I'd never done in 15 years, and focused on making the house habitable for 2 small children who seemed to exist half in this world and half in another. They ate little, as Luna had warned, but what they consumed was telling. Raw meat disappeared from my refrigerator, along with the bottle of red wine I'd been saving. They drank water mixed with drops of my blood, something they requested so matter-of-factly that I complied before my rational mind could object. During the day, they slept deeply, curled together like puppies in the guest room with its heavy curtains. At night, they came alive with an energy that reminded me of my own nocturnal nature. We played quiet games by lamplight, and they told me fragments of stories their mother had shared, tales of vampire courts and ancient bloodlines, of kings who ruled from shadow thrones and the curse that had scattered them to the winds. "Mama said you would know about the covenant," Mira said on the third night, her small fingers tracing patterns on the coffee table that looked suspiciously like ritual symbols. The word hit me like a physical blow. The covenant. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over a century, hadn't allowed myself to think about the ancient council that had once governed our kind with iron discipline and merciless judgment. "What did she tell you about the covenant?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "That they're coming back," Luna whispered, her eyes wide in the lamplight. "That they want to finish what they started." Before I could respond, before I could process the implications of what she'd said, the doorbell rang. It was past midnight on a Thursday. No one had reason to visit me at this hour, and the sound sent ice through my veins. I motioned for the girls to stay quiet and moved to the front window, peering through a gap in the curtains. A woman stood on my doorstep, her dark hair damp from the Seattle drizzle. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with the kind of beauty that seemed to glow from within despite the exhaustion etched in her features. But it was her scent that made my breath catch. The same ancient power that clung to the twins, but stronger, more concentrated. "Mama," Mira breathed behind me, and I realized she'd crept up to look out the window despite my instructions to stay hidden. The woman on my doorstep was Hannah, the mother who had sent her children into the night to find me. And from the way she held herself, the careful way she scanned the shadows around my house, she knew exactly what kind of creature had taken them in. I opened the door slowly, keeping my body between her and the interior of the house. Up close, she was even more striking, with eyes that held the same ancient knowledge as her daughters, but tempered with a desperation that made my chest tighten. "Dr. Miller," she said, her voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Hannah." It wasn't a question. The resemblance was unmistakable, and the way Mira had whispered "Mama" left no doubt. She nodded, her gaze flicking past me toward the living room where I knew the twins were hiding. "May I come in?" Every instinct screamed at me to refuse. This woman represented complications I wasn't prepared to handle, questions I didn't want to answer. But she was also their mother, and despite everything supernatural about this situation, that bond carried weight I couldn't ignore. I stepped aside, and she entered with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving through dangerous territory. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air in the house seemed to thicken with power. Whatever these three were, their combined presence created something that made my vampire senses sing with recognition and warning. "Girls," Hannah called softly, and they emerged from the living room like shadows given form. The reunion was quiet but intense, all three of them speaking in rapid Romanian while I stood awkwardly in my own entryway. Finally, Hannah turned back to me, her daughters pressed close to her sides. "Thank you," she said simply, "for keeping them safe." "Safe from what?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Her expression darkened, and she glanced toward the windows as if expecting to see watchers in the shadows. "From those who would use their blood to reclaim what was lost," she said. "The covenant has been gathering strength, Dr. Miller. They know about the twins, about what their lineage represents." The confirmation of my worst fears settled in my stomach like a stone. The covenant, The ancient council that had once ruled vampire society with absolute authority was not the historical relic I'd hoped it had become. "And what does their lineage represent?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer would change everything. Hannah's smile was sad and knowing. "They are the last of the Dracul bloodline, the true heirs to the Shadow Throne." The words hit me like a physical blow. Dracul, the name that had once struck terror into the hearts of both vampire and human alike. The bloodline that had produced the most powerful vampire kings in history, including the one who had cursed me to this half-existence between life and death. I staggered backward, my carefully controlled facade cracking. "That's impossible. The Dracul line was extinguished centuries ago." "Hidden," Hannah corrected. "Scattered and hidden, but not destroyed. My grandmother was the last known heir, and she spent her life running from those who would use her blood to legitimize their claim to power. And now the Covenant knows about them," I said, the pieces falling into place with horrifying clarity. She nodded. "They've been hunting us for months. I thought I could keep them safe, keep them hidden, but—" She trailed off, her hand moving protectively to rest on Mira's shoulder. "They found us in Portland. We barely escaped." "So you sent them to me." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. I sent them to the one person in Seattle whose reputation preceded him, the vampire king who chose exile over empire, who turned his back on power to live among the dead. Her eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of something that might have been admiration. "I gambled that your conscience was stronger than your hunger." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 15 years trying to escape my past, only to have it delivered to my doorstep in the form of 2 6-year-old girls who carried the blood of my greatest enemy. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Protection," she said simply. "The Covenant will come for them, and when they do, they'll need someone who understands the old ways, someone who remembers what it means to be a king." Before I could respond, before I could process the full implications of what she was asking, a sound split the night outside. Sharp and piercing, like metal scraping against stone, it rose from the darkness beyond my carefully tended hedges. Hannah went rigid, her face draining of color. "No," she whispered. "They found us." The twins pressed closer to their mother, their small faces reflecting a terror that belonged to creatures who had learned to fear the dark. And in that moment, as the sound came again, closer this time, more insistent, I realized that my 15 years of careful anonymity were about to come to a violent end. "The challenge horn," Hannah breathed, her voice barely audible. "House Corvus." I knew that name. Knew it from the darkest chapters of vampire history. House Corvus, the Covenant's enforcers, the ones who carried out the Council's will with ruthless efficiency. If they were here, it meant the situation had escalated beyond simple retrieval. It meant they intended to make an example. The sound came a third time, and with it, I caught the scent of something that made my blood run cold. Other vampires, old and powerful, surrounding my house like a pack of wolves closing in for the kill. I looked at Hannah, at the twins pressed against her sides, at the family that had somehow become my responsibility in the space of a few short days. The curse that had stripped me of my power, that had condemned me to this half-life among the dead, suddenly felt less like punishment and more like preparation. "Take them upstairs," I said, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't used in decades. "Lock the door and don't come out until I call for you." "Ethan," Hannah started, but I cut her off with a look. I said I'm not a king anymore, I told her, feeling something ancient and dangerous stirring in my chest. But some things are worth reclaiming a throne for. As they disappeared up the stairs, I moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. Shapes moved between the trees, pale forms that seemed to glide rather than walk. The Covenant had found us, and they'd brought enough force to ensure there would be no escape. I closed my eyes and reached deep into the part of myself I'd kept locked away for 15 years. The power was still there, diminished but not destroyed, waiting for the moment when I would need it most. That moment had arrived. The challenge horn sounded again, and this time I heard something else beneath its piercing call. Whispers in the old tongue, voices that spoke of judgment and retribution. They weren't just here to retrieve the twins. They were here to drag me back to face the court I'd abandoned, to answer for crimes I'd spent decades trying to forget. I opened my eyes and smiled, feeling my fangs extend for the first time in years. Let them come. I'd been running from my past for too long, and these children, these impossible, beautiful children, had reminded me what it meant to have something worth fighting for. The whispers grew louder, closer, and I could hear the soft scrape of claws against my front door. House Corvus had arrived, and with them, the reckoning I'd always known would come. But as their voices rose in the ancient challenge, as the shadows outside my windows began to take shape, I realized something that sent both terror and exhilaration coursing through my veins. I was no longer running. The door shuddered under the impact of something that definitely wasn't human, and I heard Hannah's sharp intake of breath from somewhere upstairs. The twins were silent, but I could feel their presence like a warm weight against my consciousness, their ancient blood calling to mine across the distance. Whatever happened next, whatever price the Covenant demanded for my years of exile, I would face it as what I'd once been, a king who had chosen love over power, redemption over dominion. The door splintered, and darkness poured into my carefully constructed human life like a tide of judgment and memory. A figure stepped through the ruined doorway, tall and pale with eyes like chips of obsidian. I recognized him immediately. Marcus Corvus, the Covenant's chief enforcer, the vampire who had personally delivered my sentence of exile all those decades ago. "Hello, Ethan," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "It's time to come home." Behind him, more shapes moved in the darkness, and I caught glimpses of faces I'd hoped never to see again. The Covenant had come in force, and they'd brought with them all the power and authority of the shadow court I'd once ruled. But as Marcus stepped into my living room, as his cold gaze swept over the domestic scene I'd built for myself, I saw something flicker in his expression that gave me hope. Surprise. He hadn't expected to find me like this. Not the broken exile they'd banished, but something else. Something that still carried the bearing of a king, even in defeat. "I'm not going anywhere," I said quietly, and for the first time in 15 years, I meant it. The words hung in the air between us, a challenge that would reshape everything. Above us, I could hear Hannah whispering to the twins in the old language, words of comfort and protection that made my chest tight with emotions I'd thought were dead. Marcus smiled, revealing fangs that gleamed like ivory in the lamplight. "We'll see about that," he said, and raised his hand in a gesture I recognized from the old court. The gesture of formal challenge, the beginning of a trial that would determine not just my fate, but the fate of the children who had awakened the king I'd tried so hard to bury. As his followers poured into my house like a tide of darkness, as the careful human life I'd built crumbled around me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The thrill of battle, the fierce joy of having something worth dying for. The twins' blood sang in my veins, calling to the power I'd abandoned. And for the first time since my exile began, I answered. The power erupted from me like a dam breaking, 15 years of suppressed authority flooding back in a torrent of silver fire. Marcus stumbled backward, his obsidian eyes widening as my true nature blazed to life. The air itself seemed to bow before me, shadows writhing away from the ancient majesty I'd kept buried for so long. Impossible, he breathed, but his voice carried uncertainty now. The curse was never about stripping my power, I said, rising to my full height as ethereal light poured from my skin. It was about learning what it meant to be worthy of it. The other Covenant members pressed through my doorway, but they moved with the hesitation of predators who had suddenly realized their prey might be more dangerous than anticipated. I could smell their fear beneath the cold authority they projected, could hear the rapid flutter of hearts that hadn't beaten in centuries. Above us, Hannah's whispered prayers grew stronger, and I felt the twins' ancient blood responding to mine, creating a resonance that made the house itself hum with power. They were calling to me, these impossible children who carried the legacy of my greatest enemies and had somehow become my salvation. You abandoned your throne, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. You have no claim here. I didn't abandon it, I replied, feeling the truth of the words as they left my lips. I was learning how to deserve it. The confrontation might have escalated then, might have devolved into the kind of violence that had defined vampire politics for millennia. But a new sound cut through the tension. Footsteps on the stairs, light and determined, followed by Hannah's sharp intake of breath. Mira appeared at the top of the staircase, her small face grave with the weight of ancient knowledge. Luna stood beside her, and together they began to descend, their mother trailing behind with a mixture of terror and resignation in her eyes. You don't need to hide us anymore, Mira said, her 6-year-old voice carrying the authority of bloodlines that stretched back to the dawn of vampire civilization. We know who we are. Marcus turned toward them, his predatory instincts overriding his caution. The Dracul heirs, he said, and I heard hunger in his voice. Do you know what your blood can do? What power it can restore to those worthy of wielding it? We know what it's already done, Luna said simply, and her dark eyes found mine across the room. It woke up the king who was sleeping. The words hit me like a revelation, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was solving, clicking into place with devastating clarity. The twins' blood hadn't just awakened my power, it had awakened my purpose. For 15 years, I'd been a king without a kingdom, a protector without anyone to protect. These children had given me something I'd thought was lost forever, a reason to be what I was meant to be. The blood remembers, Hannah said softly, moving to stand beside her daughters. It calls to its own kind, seeks out those who can understand its burden. I looked at this family, this impossible, beautiful family, and felt something shift inside me. The curse that had bound me for so long wasn't breaking. It was transforming, becoming something else entirely. Not punishment, but preparation. Not exile, but education. You want the throne back, Marcus said, and there was calculation in his voice now. The Covenant could restore you, make you what you once were. All we ask is, no. The word came out with such finality that even the shadows seemed to pause. Marcus blinked, clearly not having expected this response. The old ways are dead, I continued, feeling the truth of it settle in my bones. The shadow courts, the blood hierarchies, the endless hunger for power over others. It's all poison. It's what created the curse in the first place. I moved toward the twins, and Marcus stepped aside despite himself. The power radiating from me wasn't the cold authority of the old vampire kings. It was something warmer, more protective, something that had learned the difference between ruling through fear and leading through love. These children don't need a king, I said, kneeling before Mira and Luna so I could meet their eyes. They need a guardian, someone who understands what their blood means and will help them choose how to use it. The Covenant will never allow, Marcus started, but I cut him off with a look that made him take an involuntary step backward. The Covenant has no power here, I said, rising to face him. This is my domain, and these are my people. If you want to challenge that, then let's settle this the old way. The formal challenge hung in the air between us, ancient and binding. Marcus's followers shifted nervously, recognizing the trap I'd laid. In the old courts, a challenge could only be refused by admitting weakness, and Marcus's pride would never allow that. But as he opened his mouth to accept, Luna stepped forward and placed her small hand in mine. "He doesn't want to fight you," she said, her voice carrying a wisdom that belonged to someone far older. "He's scared." The simple truth of it stopped Marcus cold. I could see it in his eyes, not just fear of my restored power, but fear of what I represented. A vampire who had found something beyond the endless hunger, who had discovered that true strength came not from domination, but from protection. "The old ways are dying," I said gently, and for the first time, I felt pity for this creature who had once terrified me. You can die with them, or you can learn to live with what's coming next. Marcus looked around my living room, at the domestic warmth I'd created, at the family I'd chosen to protect, at the evidence of a vampire who had found peace in service rather than dominion. I could see the moment when his certainty cracked, when the absolute authority of the Covenant met something it couldn't understand or control. "This isn't over," he said finally, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Hannah said, moving to stand beside me. "The blood has chosen its guardian. The Dracul line recognizes its protector." As if summoned by her words, power flowed between us, mine, hers, and the ancient legacy carried in the twins' veins. It wasn't the cold fire of vampire authority, but something warmer and more enduring. The power of family, of chosen bonds that transcended blood and species. Marcus felt it too. I could see the recognition in his eyes, the understanding that he was witnessing something unprecedented in vampire history. A king who had chosen love over power, who had found strength in protection rather than conquest. "The Covenant will remember this," he said, but he was already backing toward the door. "Good," I replied. "Tell them that the age of shadow courts is ending. Tell them that the future belongs to those who choose to build rather than destroy." One by one, his followers melted back into the darkness, their forms dissolving like smoke in the Seattle rain. Marcus was the last to go, pausing in my ruined doorway to look back at the scene he was leaving behind. "You could have had everything," he said, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. I looked down at Mira and Luna, at their small hands warm in mine, at Hannah whose eyes held a gratitude deeper than words. The house around us hummed with the contentment of a family finally complete, the peace of a guardian who had found his purpose. "I do have everything," I said simply. Marcus vanished into the night, and with him went the last connection to the vampire I'd once been. The silence that followed felt different from the oppressive quiet of my exile. This was the peaceful silence of a home where love lived, where ancient curses had been transformed into blessings. "Is it really over?" Hannah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I considered the question, feeling the changed nature of the power that flowed through me. The curse was still there, but it no longer felt like chains. It felt like roots, anchoring me to something more important than any throne. "The old story is over," I said. "The new one is just beginning." Over the following weeks, as winter deepened into the heart of Seattle's rainy season, we learned to be a family in ways that defied every convention of both human and vampire society. The twins flourished under my protection, their ancient blood settling into a rhythm that spoke of peace rather than power. Hannah's gratitude evolved into something deeper, a partnership built on shared understanding of what it meant to guard something precious. I returned to my work at the medical examiner's office, but everything had changed. The dead no longer whispered of loneliness and regret. They spoke of completion, of stories that had found their proper endings. My colleagues noticed the change. Dr. Martinez commented that I seemed more alive somehow, though she couldn't have known how literally true that was. The twins adapted to human life with the fluid grace of creatures born to exist between worlds. They attended a small private school where their unusual insights were attributed to advanced intelligence rather than ancient bloodlines. In the evenings, they would help me in the garden behind my house, their small hands gentle with the plants that had begun to grow in soil that had been barren for 15 years. "The earth remembers," Mira said one evening as we planted bulbs that would bloom in spring. "It knows when something dead has learned to live again." Hannah had found work as a translator, her knowledge of ancient languages proving valuable to the university's archaeology department. She moved through our shared life with the quiet grace of someone who had finally found a safe harbor after years of running. Sometimes I would catch her watching me with an expression of wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe that the monster from the old stories had become the man who made her daughters laugh. The house itself seemed to exhale, releasing decades of held breath. Rooms that had been closed for years opened to accommodate our growing family. The kitchen filled with the sounds of conversation and the smell of meals shared in warmth and safety. Even my basement laboratory, once a cold reminder of my isolation among the dead, became a place where Luna would sit and ask questions about the mysteries of life and death while I worked. "Do you miss it?" she asked one night, her dark eyes serious in the fluorescent light. "Being a king?" I paused in my examination of tissue samples, considering her question with the gravity it deserved. "I thought I would," I admitted. For centuries, power was all I knew. But power without purpose is just hunger, and I was so hungry for so long. And now? I looked at her, this impossible child who had taught me the difference between ruling and protecting, between commanding and serving. "Now I'm full," I said simply. The changes weren't just internal. My reflection, which had been absent for centuries, began to appear in mirrors, faint at first, like a ghost learning to be solid, but growing stronger each day. My body, preserved in the prime of life by vampire immortality, began to show subtle signs of the humanity I was reclaiming. Lines around my eyes that spoke of laughter rather than cruelty. A warmth to my skin that had nothing to do with feeding and everything to do with love. Hannah noticed these changes before I did. "You're becoming human again," she said one morning, tracing the new lines on my face with gentle fingers. Not human, I corrected, catching her hand and pressing it to my chest, where a heart had begun to beat with something approaching regularity. Something new. Something that's learned to be both monster and man. The Covenant made no further attempts to contact us, though I sometimes sensed watchers in the shadows beyond my property. They were learning, as I had learned, that some transformations couldn't be undone by force or politics. The twins' blood had chosen its guardian, and that choice carried weight in the old laws that even the Covenant couldn't ignore. Spring came early to Seattle that year, bringing with it a warmth that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The bulbs we'd planted bloomed in riots of color that drew neighbors to comment on the sudden transformation of my once barren garden. Children from the local school began to visit, drawn by Mira and Luna's quiet charisma and my own newfound ability to exist in daylight without discomfort. "You've built something beautiful here," Hannah said one evening as we watched the twins play in the garden with their new friends. The sound of laughter filled the air, mixing with the scent of blooming flowers and the distant hum of the city. "We've built something beautiful," I corrected, and felt the truth of it settle in my bones like a benediction. As the sun set over Seattle, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I stood in my garden surrounded by the family I'd chosen and the life I'd learned to deserve. The curse that had once bound me to darkness had become the blessing that taught me to appreciate light. The exile that had seemed like punishment had been preparation for this moment, this perfect ordinary evening that contained more magic than any shadow throne ever could. The twins ran to me, their faces bright with the simple joy of children who knew they were loved and protected. Hannah's hand found mine, warm and real and anchoring me to this new existence I'd never dared to dream possible. Above us, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and I felt no urge to hide from their light. I had been a king of shadows, a creature of darkness and hunger. But I had learned to be something better, a guardian of light, a protector of innocence. A man who had discovered that true immortality wasn't about living forever, but about creating something worth preserving. The scent of blooming jasmine drifted on the evening breeze, sweet and alive and full of promise. It was nothing like the cold, antiseptic smell of the morgue where I'd spent my exile. Nothing like the metallic tang of blood that had once defined my existence. This was the scent of home, of family, of a future that stretched ahead of us bright with possibility. As I gathered my chosen family close, as the lights of Seattle twinkled to life around us like earthbound stars, I finally understood what the curse had been trying to teach me all along. Sometimes the greatest power comes not from ruling others, but from learning to serve something greater than yourself. The night was warm, the garden was alive, and for the first time in centuries, I was exactly where I belonged.